name's Rory Sutherland. I'm the Vice Chairman of Ogilvy in the UK, and I'm also the founder of something called the Ogilvy Behavioural Science practice. And what behavioural science aims to do is to both explain, understand, and better respond to questions in business decision-making, in economics, indeed in government and public policy, through a better understanding of human psychology. And we would aver that quite a lot of mistakes have been made in decision-making through leaving psychology out of the equation. And we think that conventional economics is particularly guilty of this. It effectively assumes that people have perfect knowledge of their own preferences. It assumes they know exactly what they want, they know exactly how much they're prepared to pay for something, and they completely trust the person who's selling it to them. Now, the problem with this is that economics does it because it enables them to simplify the mathematics around human decision-making and behaviour. The problem is that the trade-off you make by ignoring human psychology probably blinds you to an enormous number of potential solutions and interventions which would be possible if only you considered how people feel, think, decide and act, rather than using a kind of economic theoretical agent to take the place of real human beings. So just to give a couple of examples from the consumer space, if Nestlé had been completely rational, they would never have launched Nespresso. They would have looked at their data and said, well, there's no evidence that people are prepared to pay 50, 60 pence, 60 or 70 cents for a cup of coffee consumed at home. Everything we know about what people pay for coffee at home tells us that there is no available space there. Yet when you create the Nespresso machine and you pay by the pod, not by the packet, our perception of price completely changes. And that's because the frame of reference perhaps is no longer Nescafe or Illy. Instead, it's Starbucks. And so what might seem expensive in one context or in one set of comparison can seem cheap in another. Uber, in fact, plenty of billion-dollar ideas, including Amazon Prime, I'd include Uber in that, I'd include Red Bull, make no conventional logical sense when viewed through the mind of an economist or through the eyes of a market researcher. People would claim not to be remotely interested in a drink that doesn't taste conventionally very nice. And yet when we look at the actual business success, we start to see the potential opportunity cost that comes if you ignore psychological factors in the innovations, the new products you launch, or the way you promote them. Now, conventionally, this is a discipline which is mostly applied to B2C activities. We've come to a very interesting conclusion, which is that the very same insights that can inform and illuminate B2C decision-making through behavioural science can be perhaps even more applicable in understanding B2B decisions. And we think there are several reasons why behavioural science has been grossly overlooked and undervalued in the B2B community. And in this talk, what we'll do is we'll describe some of them. So I'm particularly grateful here to LinkedIn for founding the B2B Institute. I think for far too long, particularly in marketing, B2B has been viewed as the kind of stepchild of consumer marketing. And we think not only is this a mistake, in fact, we think that B2B is ripe for even more marketing and behavioural attention than B2C is. And so through our research, which is in partnership with LinkedIn's B2B Institute, we expose the conclusion that B2B in many ways is even more emotional than B2C. And I'm here to tell you today why behavioural science in marketing, why it matters so much, and why especially it matters in the area where it's most overlooked, which is in business-to-business activity. B2B accounts for about 50% of the economy. Nearly 40% of UK companies derive all or the vast majority of their income from B2B activity. A further 42% on top of that 40% are hybrids, with some of their income coming from both B2B and B2C. And while it's impossible for us to know and completely separate the exact size of value of B2B internationally, we do know that it accounts for 44% or 1.7 trillion of Britain's business turnover, and about 21 billion in corporate tax. Over 50% of UK FTSE 350 firms are pure B2B businesses. And unlike B2C, we in Britain actually have a global trade surplus on our B2B activity. Now, what's going on here? Well, first of all, when people think of businesses, most people are consumers, so unsurprisingly, they're more likely to think of a Unilever or a soap manufacturer than they are to think about someone who produces industrial pumping equipment. That's part of it. When it comes to marketing, of course, B2C marketing is hugely visible, whereas a lot of B2B marketing isn't. But we also think there's another prevailing problem which is much more severe, which is what you might call the myth of rationality, which is that we all like to maintain the pretense that the second anybody sits behind a desk or puts on a suit, they immediately lose all their behavioural biases, they park their emotions in the car park, and they sit there making entirely rational decisions like a conventionally rational economic agent, free of any kind of emotional or perceptual influence. And the simple thing is, you don't become rational the moment you put on a suit. If business people are really that rational, why do they play so much golf? So the reason I think we need a completely new map, as I call it, for B2B, is because this very standard myth of the entirely rational actor has become ludicrously over-prevalent in making decisions relating to B2B. In many ways, one of the things we've discovered is institutional settings create more behavioural bias than you find in individual decision making. Because in many cases, the need to defend and justify and explain your decision, in many cases in B2B, outweighs the importance of actually making a good decision. Fear of blame is a more potent force than fear of regret, if you like. And so what happens is this assumption of complete rationality, as though because someone's wearing a suit and sitting in a business meeting, they act exactly like the homo economicus of economic models, where they're only interested in the kind of things that, economists and highly rational entities like management consultancies would consider important. The only way you can improve something is by improving the efficiency of manufacture, lowering the price, or indeed objectively improving the product. What's completely overlooked in that model is that by simply telling a different story about something, presenting it in a different context or a different light, or indeed pricing in a completely new and different way, can actually add value to the relationship just as much as objective improvements can. And so this objective map is a problem because it's very beguiling, because it helps us make sense of the world. Unfortunately, it helps us make sense of the world in a way that isn't wholly accurate. Moreover, when everybody uses the same map, it creates the opportunity for someone to establish a kind of mental monopoly by looking at a different kind of map or by prioritizing different things. And so the reason I use this map analogy all the time is by analogy with the London Tube map. It's a wonderful way of understanding the interconnectedness of London tube lines. It was designed by an electrical engineer, Harry Beck, who used wiring diagrams as his inspiration. The only problem is what starts off by being a useful mental aid ends up as a kind of mental prison. After a time, the map stops being useful and starts defining your very impression of London. And if your idea of London is constrained purely to what happens to appear on the tube map, there will be whole dark areas about which you know nothing at all, which you therefore ridiculously ignore. And we argue that actually it's in those areas that are covered by your map and nobody else's that you genuinely find economic value. There's a very simple and important point about marketing, which I think tends to mean that marketing gets dangerously overlooked in B2B. And that's because people have started to conflate marketing with marcoms. And because as a proportion of overall spend, B2B will tend to spend less on comms than you find in B2C. What that means is that marketers are less often represented at board level, that the people who are making business decisions have often spent no time at all working in marketing. And as a result, the loss is that you lose a particular frame of reference or mindset that you find in marketers that you tend not to find in everybody else. Most people in business, if you're in logistics, for example, if you're in most areas of business activity, you see your job as a kind of optimization problem. You look at the world with the eyes of a system controller, and you essentially also look at the world through averages. Most of the data you receive is an amalgamation. It's an aggregate of lots and lots of individual decisions, and you seek to read reality by looking at essentially aggregate average information. What makes a marketer different and what makes their viewpoint uniquely valuable is that a marketer, instinctively and through practice, tends to look at the world through a customer's eye view. So they will not ask the question, okay, what does this product or service look like in terms of increasing or decreasing sales? They will actually look at an individual customer's experience of the world over time. Now, you might argue that, for example, Amazon Prime is an example of a marketing mindset. What Bezos suddenly realized is that whereas 10 people don't mind paying £3 once a month to pay for delivery, one person isn't going to like paying £3 10 times a month. And therefore, if you want to have frequent customers, you have to solve this problem. Another example of a marketing mindset is understanding whether something sounds expensive or whether it sounds cheap. Now, you can entirely change perception of how expensive something is by choosing a different frame of reference. Now, I would argue that procurement play this trick all the time. What they do is they add up the sum total of what you spend, of what their company spends with you, and they more or less suggest that you should reduce this by 10%. It's in a way, it's a way of looking at the world that drives you towards cost cutting. On the other hand, there are ways you can price which make something relatively expensive seem very cheap. And one of my favourite examples is of a company which operates solely in providing legal services to transport companies. And the way they frame the pricing of this is, we cost you 20 pence per vehicle per day. Now, framed against the as-new cost of a bus, 20 pence is basically trivial. You see that as a rounding error. It's not something you should be concerned by. He does something even more ingenious, which is every time he speaks at a conference, he leaves small coins under people's chairs and says, and you've got your first day's legal cover for free, because people can root under their chair and find 20 or 30 pence there. Now, the point is, in selling Lucky Charms or breakfast cereal, people probably recognise that, these psychological factors matter. In B2B, where they're used only to looking at aggregate business data, not experiential data, this kind of angle gets completely overlooked. The bad news is that I think a lot of mistakes are made because no one has access to the marketing viewpoint. The good news, on the other hand, is there are spectacular opportunities to be had for those few companies who do. So when we look at institutional decision-making, one of the things that surprised me is that biases in making a decision in an institution are almost certainly stronger than when making consumer decisions. When consumers make a decision, they're allowed to factor in a lot of things, what you might call unconscious second-order information, like brand quality, for example, into their decision. What they're trying to do is to avoid making a decision they'll subsequently regret. Now, the difference is in institutional decision-making, in many ways, the quality of your justification of your decision is more important to you than the quality of the outcome. Because there are huge asymmetries in terms of making a good or bad decision as to whether it appears to be rational or whether it appears not to be. So broadly speaking, if you make an irrational, ill-defended decision and things go wrong, you lose your job. If you make a rational decision which goes wrong, you generally keep your job and blame falls somewhere else. And so once you look at it through the lens of what Gerd Gigerenzer calls defensive decision-making, essentially, it's through the lens of blame aversion. What you understand is that, well, exactly what's summed up in the greatest B2B line of all time, IBM's "No one ever got fired for buying IBM." Because what's going on there is that the outcomes are massively asymmetrical. If you do particularly well, you might get a little bit of a reward or a promotion or a bonus. If you make a mistake, you lose your job. So there's a huge asymmetry there in terms of the consequences. And so what this leads people to do is to make decisions that are the least likely to incur negative consequences for them rather than making the decisions that are best for the organisation. And you might argue that a huge amount of the activity that goes on within businesses is, in a sense, arse covering disguised as rigour. In other words, the more lengthy the process you go through to arrive at a decision and the more people you involve, the less likely it is that blame's going to fall squarely on you. Now, when you immediately start saying to this, well, that's true of other companies, but obviously not true of my own, be careful. This bias is found much more widely than just in businesses. You also find it, for example, in medicine, where doctors are much happier referring someone to a consultant for exploratory surgery than leaving them to get better on their own, even though the statistics may say no intervention is probably the best bet. Why do they do this? Because you can get sued for doing nothing, but it won't be you who gets sued if you do something. And so large areas of activity, in many cases either economically useless or in some cases deleterious, quite often go on within businesses essentially to shore up the career of the decision maker rather than to actually pursue what's economically best for the organisation as a whole. I think some of the problems we've talked about here aren't confined to B2B companies. I think they're common in any company which has a very strong engineering or financial or economic mindset. Tech companies are also guilty of this, because in the technical world, it's normally absolutely clear what problem you have to solve. The metrics that are available to you are the metrics that really matter. And therefore, if you're seeking to make a car faster, the task is clear and the engineering challenge can be neatly broken down. The problem with psychological challenges is they ain't so neat, because in psychological challenges, in marketing challenges, the metrics aren't decided by you or by the laws of physics. They're actually decided by the customer. And so it's vitally important, I think, if you have kind of a train company, people will obsess about things like punctuality and speed, which may or may not be what customers really care about. Customers may, to be honest, at least in the light of experience, vastly prefer a 40-minute train journey where there's a seat-back table and a good Wi-Fi signal to a 30-minute journey where they can't use their laptop and there's no connectivity. So what matters changes according to the whims of customers. It's made more complicated still because one of the most important lessons of behavioural science is that people don't fully know what they themselves want. We don't have introspective access into our needs and wants to the extent that we believe. So in many cases, you can't rely on economic logic to tell you what to do, but you can't rely on customers to tell you what to do because they don't completely know. Most people will say, I don't like waiting a long time for a cab. They won't say, I wish there were a map that reduced my degree of uncertainty about the wait. But in psychological terms, reducing the uncertainty is more important than reducing the duration. That's my point about this. Now, in any organisation where sales tend to dominate marketing, the metric will be leads. And if you become obsessed with only doing things you can measure, and only doing things the efficacy of which you can prove and quantify in advance, it makes you look like a very scientific organisation. But that very same reductionist thinking is also hugely limiting when it comes to solving problems. Many marketing activities, I would argue, are probabilistic rather than reductionist. In other words, you do things because being famous massively increases the likely opportunity that you'll be presented with. People will come to you with new ideas. People will return your chief executive's phone calls. People will want to work for you more. People will work for you for less money because you're a famous company to put on your CV. Now, it's generally impossible to predict these effects in advance, and in many cases, it's impossible to measure them in retrospect. But the problem is, if you can only do the things the efficacy of which you can predict and measure, it limits your course of action to a very, very limited range of activities, which is you end up doing what you can prove, not doing what works. Not investing in fame is a cost. Being obscure brings enormous opportunity costs, but they're opportunity costs that you can't really quantify. In fact, there's a brilliant LinkedIn article written by a LinkedIn employee called Quantum Marketing, which makes exactly this same point. Now, I think my teenage kids understand fame instinctively better than many professional marketers do, which is the reason they go to parties is not because they have a specific strategy for each party they attend or because they've done a cost-benefit analysis beforehand. They simply know that if you don't actually make yourself known, fortunate things never happen to you. What could happen when you go to a party is the payoff could be romantic, it could be sexual, it could be you get invited to another better party, you might get invited on holiday, you might discover some interesting gossip about jobs that are suddenly available. You don't know in advance. Indeed, attending a trade fair in the days where trade fairs existed was a very similar thing. You went along in the hope that something good would happen, but also in the instinctive knowledge that if you weren't there, nothing good would ever happen. And what my daughters understand is if you stay home on Saturday night, there's no positive upside to be had. Now, I would argue when we look at marketing, we need to look at the opportunity cost of not doing it much more rigorously and spend less time obsessing about the measurable benefits to doing it. It isn't necessarily possible to predict the advantages of fame in advance or to put a dollar value on what it's worth, partly because many of the benefits that accrue through fame will never be directly attributable. If you're the chief executive of a famous company, when you ring someone up, they return your call. Now, that's inordinately valuable in and of itself, but it's not valuable in a quantifiable way. And I think there's a danger that in our obsession with only doing those things we can measure, we limit ourselves to perhaps 10% of the value that marketing can bring. There's a wonderful phrase in business which is what gets measured gets managed, but there's also a concomitant phrase to that, which is what gets mismeasured gets mismanaged. And I think in many cases the things we're failing to measure, things which are impossible to measure, are in danger of creating enormous blind spots in business activity. One of the huge values, as I said, that B2B practitioners can bring is simply by using a different map, looking at behavioural questions and questions of perception rather than the questions of objective reality. And the really vital thing you can do by achieving this is differentiate yourself. If all your competitors are making rational decisions based on the assumption of a completely rational consumer, what they're doing is they're becoming more and more alike because they're looking at exactly the same data and making exactly the same assumptions with it. There's not much money to be made in commoditizing yourself because your life will always be a battle with your cheapest and most desperate competitor. What you can do psychologically is you can differentiate yourself. And you can do that by looking at things through the customer's eye view, not through the balance sheet eye view. It's the very messiness of marketing which in a way makes it a valuable place to look. Because there's a lot of uncertainty there, there's a degree of probabilisticness to what you do, but it's the very uncertainty that makes it an unpopular place for all your competitors to look. That's one way in which you can actually sell yourself in a completely different way to everybody else, by looking at psychological innovation, what we call innovation, rather than technical innovation. The great problem with technical innovation is a good technological innovation can be copied in months, but a psychological one actually endures. It's how a product or service makes you feel is a much more long-lasting effect on human behaviour than what its objective attributes are. You know, we act according to our feelings, not according to data. And feelings around a brand simply endure longer and are longer lasting and more lucrative, and in many cases vastly cheaper to produce than simple improvements in specifications or objective reality. And so one of the things we'd say is that there's always a huge opportunity for innovation in psychology, even when innovation in technology becomes really, really different. The same thing presented in a different way, with a different story attached or a different frame of comparison, effectively, as far as humans perceive it, is a different thing. Once you understand some of the biases that are present in collective decision-making, that in many ways we care more about what we think, what other people think of our decisions, than we care about the quality of our decisions or the outcomes. Once you understand loss aversion and some of the other biases that are prevalent in decision-making, what it does is it provides you with a completely new way of looking at the world. And a completely new way of looking at the world is generally the best way to innovate.